Yes, good to see you again. I assume everyone can see my screen. Perfect. Okay. Thanks for the opportunity. I will be, like every good professor at my stage in the career, talking about work that's been done in large part by some graduate students, mostly Simon Kais, who's a real ace in the field. When we were out on a kind of recruiting birdwatching trip in the Rio Grande Valley, a yellow-rumped an orange-crowned warbler chipped, and he identified it straight up. I was like, okay, this kid's got potential. So he's done some great work along with Kelly, and you can see some of the other organizations that have been involved in here. So with no further ado, let's talk about the red-crowned parrot. It's green, it's red, it's big, and it's loud, 13 inches from head to tail, about 3/4 of a pound of bird. Lovely things in the right light, that is for certain. The species is globally endangered, according to BirdLife and IUCN. It's only found in northeastern Mexico. Here you can see the range in a variety of colors. But it's been eliminated from 25% to about 75%, depending on how you slice it, of its historic range, being threatened by habitat loss and illegal capture for the pet trade. And we'll talk a little bit about the Texas part. In the United States, it's been introduced in Southern California, Florida, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii, with the California population being the really large one. And then it's also found in South Texas, where we'll be talking mostly. In South Texas, thank you, eBird, for our maps. It's found in the 4 major cities along the lower Rio Grande Valley: Brownsville, Harlingen, Weslaco, and McAllen. And each one of those has its very own roost. And on a good night through most of the year, there will be a big chunk of parrots roosting in each one of these 4 cities. So now, one of the big questions that bird watchers are often interested in: are the red-crowned parrots actually native or just naturalized in Texas? I think they're considered countable, according to your ABA type lists, but it's difficult for real to determine that answer. Their native range that they've been in, as long as we know about, is less than about 150 miles south of the US border, which means that's only probably about a 6-hour flight straight north. 6 hours if they did it once. If they stop and then pick up and go again, obviously not that difficult if they have a reason to head north. There are old records that suggested the parrots wandered north. Here's the Laredo Times from 1885, and it says, let's see, they were seen in post oak forests. This is the first time that they've been seen in Texas. Flocks of parrots north of Brownsville. And then in 1899, hundreds of parrots just south of Corpus Christi. Here it says that there was a drought in Tamaulipas that drove the parrots north, which all seems quite sensible. In the 1920s, they were seen in La Feria, and in 1956, they were seen in South Texas. But that's about all we've been able to pull together, in spite of the fact that there are quite a few people living and recording things in the valley. No photos, all impossible to verify, but probably we're dealing with naturally dispersing parrots coming up across the Rio Grande Valley. Now, there's a couple species of Amazons that live in that area of Tamaulipas, so not 100% sure, but we think that we're dealing with red-crowned parrots. The first modern records, a few of them occurred in protected areas from 1973 to 78. There were a couple seen at Santa Ana and Anzalduas Park. And then they started showing up in suburban Brownsville. From November 1976 to 1977, there were about 10 of them. And then from 79 on to 85, they were seen every winter in Brownsville, but not during the spring and summer. We don't know if they went back to Mexico or if they just kind of dispersed into the suburbs and nested. But at that time, the birds showed little interest in native vegetation areas. How about the history? Historically, they suggest that the habitat for the red-crowned parrot extended all the way up into Texas. This was work done by a buddy of mine, Tiberio Monterrubio, and he mapped where the habitat originally was. But the light gray, most of the habitat has actually been removed and the birds aren't there anymore. But the only problem with this issue is that there really is no historic evidence that the species was really a resident here down in South Texas. But then they suggest there's some evidence of massive smuggling up from Mexico in the mid-1970s. There's no real data to show that because nobody was really monitoring it. But once Traffic, which is the trade organization, kind of a private organization, and CITES, the global monitoring of wildlife trade databases started kicking in, you could see in the early 1980s, there were quite a few individuals coming in through legal means, and probably quite a few more that weren't declared. A buddy of mine from Austin, a bird breeder, says that he used to drive down to the border quite often to check out what was in the quarantine stations. He said the red-crowned parrots weren't very hot. They wouldn't sell very quickly. And according to him, when they got bored of listening to them scream, and nobody would buy them, they would open up the doors and let them out and let them go, which could certainly up the number of parrots living in the Rio Grande Valley. So the origins for the South Texas population really is unknown. We can't be sure of their origins, but their seasonality and their behavior suggests that first birds that came in probably were strays from Mexico. But since the 1980s, probably most of the birds that were in the valley came from escaped pets. And I can add here, but regardless of that, the state of Texas calls them native. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service calls them native. So from a regulatory perspective and from a bird watching perspective, we'll call them native from here on out. So the history, the first accepted sightings, 1973. Breeding, they've been breeding since 1985. And if you look at both Christmas bird count and eBird data, it really suggests that since the 1990s, we've had pretty good straight growth in the populations in the Rio Grande Valley. So for those of you who've been down there and for those who haven't, where would you go to look for red-crowned parrots? Would you go to the world famous Santa Ana Wildlife Refuge with one of the biggest chunks of remaining Tamaulipas thorn scrub and beautiful trees? Or would you go to Olivera Park in Brownsville, who competes by having a nice soccer field and maybe a parking lot? Can I hear somebody unmute? Where are you going to go to look for red-crowned parrots?
Brownsville.
Yep, parking lot.
Uh-oh. 29 reports in eBird from Santa Ana since 2000. Whereas we have 2,345 reports from eBird in the same time period in Olivera Park in Brownsville. So we'll talk, this is just an introduction to a theme that we'll be talking about throughout this this talk. But yeah, let's move on. And here we start the Tejano Parrot Project. It was supposedly a 3-year project, but we continue to kind of work on it a bit. From 2016 to 2019, Texas Parks and Wildlife gave the big chunk of funding, but then we've been graciously supported by Rio Grande Valley Birding Festival. They've been great. And Parrot Conservation and Research Fund. Our main goals were to figure out the population status, look at the threats to the Texas population, look more at their habitat usage, engage citizen science to monitor the species, and make some management recommendations for the future of the species. So to determine the population status, we decided to use roost counts, show up 60 to 45 minutes before sunset, check the normal roosting areas, and basically poor Simon, whose car didn't have air conditioning and he was working in the southern Rio Grande Valley in summer, but that's a different issue. He would roll down the windows and drive around the neighborhoods listening for parrots and hopefully run into them. And if we find them, you record the number of parrots, what species. I won't be talking about any of the other species tonight, but there are a variety of them in the valley. The number of adults and juveniles, what they're eating in the final roosting area. Okay, this is a good methodology question. How many parrots do we see? Simon would be taking these pictures, clicking as fast as he could. Every time a group, right before they roost, they would get up, fly around in a group, land, get up, fly around in a group, and land again. Well, it's hard to count that many birds accurately, but with your photo, you can put a white dot on each one and then count the dots. This photo has 394 parrots. I think I was with him this night. And this was his record single count. So a good night. And they landed in a tree with a beautiful view. But one of the really interesting things is, so these are some other counts that have been done by Texas Parks and Wildlife, but our data show the same thing. about 650, 670 birds, and that's 2016 to 2019, and we just had the 2021 count. It's basically flat for the last 4 or 5 years, which is really quite interesting. So we suspect that there's 650 to maybe 700 birds in the Rio Grande Valley, and this population has been pretty much stable. So the big question now, and this was a surprise, we expected that they'd be doing great and they would be continuing to increase based on not when we applied for the grant. But now the question is, why are they not growing anymore? Is it a lack of reproduction? There are other threats. Now, to figure out the lack of reproduction, I know from Peru that monitoring nests is a lot of work and it's a pain in the neck. But there are some shortcuts, and this is a shortcut that I figured out in Costa Rica when I was working with a grad student a while ago. And if we can look at adult and juvenile ratios, it can kind of give us an idea of, are these things breeding? And so we'll talk about that, and then we'll go on to poaching, nest site limitations, some other more traditional issues. Okay, adults versus juveniles. Adults, bright yellow iris, red all the way up onto the, and their behavior, not quite so silly. On juveniles, a dull gray iris, limited red up to the eye usually, very silly behavior that we'll see, and sometimes you can see a short tail on them. Simon, as I said, has a great eye, and he got out there and put in a lot of hours looking to determine the ratios in these birds. So who's who? Somebody can unmute and tell me where are the babies?
On the left and on the right.
Okay, in the blue photograph, we've got one on the left and one on the right. What about on the green photograph?
The one at the top is a juvenile.
Some serious baby going on up top. Yep. So it's doable, but it certainly requires some good light and a practiced eye. But we use this technique to calculate the adult to young ratios at roosts. And what did we find? We found some fluctuation, hard to tell statistically if they're different, but overall about 20% of the population in any August time was, within a couple months of fledging was about 20%. So to us, that looks like pretty reasonable reproduction rates. And it suggests that we have healthy recruitment. I forgot to share my sound, but you can watch some pretty silly behavior. It's pretty easy to tell where the juveniles are here. And it looks like we've got mom, who seems to pay attention, and dad, who really isn't overly excited about things. So here come two very annoying babies. Dad gives them the evil eye, then gives them the evil foot, and then foots them again. They finally give up on dad and will eventually jump over and actually knock mom off the wire. But this is the way it works. Let's see if they're really going to jump for us. Mom's trying to pay some attention. Beg from a completely random stranger who has one of our radio collars on it. Finally, sibling gets fed. He gets jealous. Beg to the stranger. Sibling gets fed again. That's even more annoying. So time to knock your buddy off. And as you can see, it all just breaks down into total chaos. So because of our reproduction that we've got in the valley, scenes like this are playing out every year, fortunately. Red-crowned parrots nest in previously existing cavities. They don't really make their own holes like woodpeckers would. You can see here sticking their head out of a palm nest. And this is in a tree, I think it's a cottonwood. So an old dead branch spot that's turned into a cavity. But what we found mostly was in these Washingtonian palms and other palms, most of which are not native species, and some ashes and a few other trees as well. Only 11% of the nests in South Texas were in native tree species. And every single nest tree we suspect was planted by a person. So now we're starting to get into some of the ridiculousness. This is an even more human-induced nest site. This is in the site of a hotel. They had actually this, for some reason, all of the cool looking parts of this are made of styrofoam, and both green parakeets and red-crowned parrots were drilling, or kind of making little holes in the side of it, or the woodpeckers were starting them, and then they were nesting up in there. Kind of ridiculous, but the pecans, ashes, and cottonwoods were all living. They're harder to find because they're not as obvious as a big dead palm tree, but so we probably undercounted them. This is a guy's front yard, and the power company came in and cut the tops off of a whole bunch of his palm trees, and all sorts of birds, whistling ducks, woodpeckers, sparrows, starlings, and red-crowned parrots were nesting all up and down this guy's front yard. Here's two of them. And just to put this in context, this is where those two nests are, the yellow stars. And you can see it's in very typical kind of residential neighborhood with a little bit of farmers' fields on the edge. For feeding, they eat mostly during the early morning and right before roost, and feed on a wide array of fruits, seeds, flowers, etc. A bunch of different things you can see here, but again, none of these feeding trees were in what we would call natural areas. A few of them are actually native, mixed with a wide variety of non-natives. Now we're back to Oliveira Park. So when this is the only place in the Rio Grande Valley where they roost every single night, as far as we can tell. Throughout the whole history of the 4 years of our study, every night they were in some combination of these yellow starred trees. And when I was there, this is the picture I took, and the birds were actually in those trees sleeping at night while we took the picture, while the kids were playing soccer underneath it. And it's funny, I've worked in a lot of places, different parts of the world, looking at parrots, and you go to the best habitat with the biggest trees, etc. That's where they're going to roost. I'm good at finding where they were. These guys totally blew my my ability to look at habitat and predict whether it would be useful or not. Because I certainly would not have pegged Oliveira Park as a good place to be a parrot. But or if you don't like Oliveira Park, if that's too well preserved for you, you can go to the front yard in the residential neighborhoods. The parrots wouldn't even bother to roost in the backyard. They would roost over the mailbox. And if we put this in context now, you can see here's a very generic neighborhood. No offense to anybody who lives there. And these are the trees that we just saw the picture of. What makes that special? And as I drove around these neighborhoods, I could not find what made those areas special. Fortunately, the parrots and humans like similar habitats: large shade trees used for roosting, used for nesting, flowering and fruiting trees used for foraging. This is called an orchid tree, and the parrots are devouring that very happily. The only habitat element that seems to be important to the parrots are kind of the dead palms and some of the half-dead trees that form the really nice nesting sites. An interesting question came up because the species was considered for listing in the Endangered Species Act, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service suggested that we had two different populations. One that went between Harlingen and Brownsville. You can see here we are in the cities in the southern Rio Grande Valley, and another group that went between McAllen and Weslaco. Simon and I immediately kind of jumped up and were like, I don't think so, but we didn't really have any information to support it. So we got some additional funding, mostly through the Rio Grande Valley Birding Festival and a little bit of leftover from Texas Parks and Wildlife, and we were able to use some telemetry to figure out the answer to that. This is what happens when the red-crowned parrot is unhappy with your transmitter. That's what they're supposed to look like. So what did we do? We captured parrots and affixed radios to them and then followed them around. Some of our volunteers were also helping follow around the parrots. To catch a parrot, this was quite interesting. This was our first trap here. I was down for that one. We put a net over the tree cavity, expected the bird would jump right out. Of course, it didn't. It took so long, we eventually ordered pizza to the house right behind us. We just we called and gave the address. And when the guy showed up, he went up to the door. And when the guy showed up, we had just caught the bird finally. And we had to run over and say, no, 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 don't knock on the door. We ordered your pizza. This one was in the parking lot of an HEB. And eventually we got tired of holding the net up and the birds got smart. We came up with a trigger system that pulled a net down over the front of the cavity, and then still had to wait for the birds to come out and fall into the net. But so with our VHF telemetry results, we found that the birds were switching roosts. Our volunteers would go out to each roost every night and listen to find out where the birds were. And in fact, the lower Rio Grande Valley only has one population, as parts of the flocks will move independently and they'll mix among the 4 cities. We also looked at day use patterns. We didn't put a huge amount of effort into this, but if you're down in the valley and you're bird watching, they tell you do not look for the parrots in the middle of the day because you won't find them. You can find them when they're foraging and calling in the morning. You can find them at the roosts in the evening, but during the day, they just disappear. So with transmitters, we can look for them. And we found that they go to the deepest, darkest centers of the gas station parking lots. This was a day roost for one of the radio collared birds and a couple of his friends right in this dinky tiny single tree right next to a gas station. And if you look at that in context, that's not really a great habitat by my definition. You've got big protected areas over here. You've got much denser neighborhoods where they could move from tree to tree. No, he was in a short little tree right next to the gas station. And so again, blows away any knowledge I thought I had of parrots. So summary of habitat use during our field research. And this I figured out with Simon in the 7-hour drive back home after our weekend. Every nesting tree we found them in was probably planted by a human being. Every roost tree was planted, and nearly every food plant was planted or at least grew in somebody's yard where somebody was basically taking care of it. There was 0 use of natural areas throughout our study. So when we think about conservation, how do we conserve species that rely on completely artificial habitats? And it takes parrot conservation and bird conservation in the US in general and really flips it on its head to start thinking about how should we be protecting these birds. So what we wanted to do yet now was step back a little bit. We had put this in the grant as an original part of what we wanted to do and look through computer modeling what drives the habitat use. We used all of our different locations and we used something called MAXENT, maximum entropy modeling. We used climate and human density maps as predictive layers of where the critters were going to be. And it turns out that the predictions for where are suitable areas in Texas for red-crowned parrots focuses almost exclusively on the Rio Grande Valley, with the possibility of it extending a little ways up towards Corpus Christi, but that's still pretty low quality habitat. Human population density is the biggie. Most important, explains 60% of the model. We've done another study that suggests how the texture of the variation of the vegetation also helps. But manual mean temperature, and this actually extends across the United States. They don't really like it to be much colder, below 7 degrees Celsius. So Acton, Massachusetts is right out. No way, you won't be getting them anytime soon. And above 17.5 is most suitable. So what? Who cares? How can we actually use information like this? Well, if we take all our green dots where eBird and Simon tell us the birds are actually hanging out, we put a little buffer around them, maybe about 10-kilometer buffer, it looks like all that's left is good suitable habitat are these little orange dots. Only about 11% of the good habitat is not already occupied by the bird. And no areas north of the Rio Grande Valley are considered to be good habitat. These are probably if you see up here in Laredo, the little yellow dots up at the top left, those are probably 2 birds or 1 or 2 birds that escaped and are hanging out in there. Probably not natural distribution. And the other thing that's interesting is just north of here is the King Ranch, which is a big, giant, completely unurbanized area. And you've got almost 100 miles from the current population up to Corpus Christi, which is a big urban area, and Laredo, which is another big urban area. It's not likely that these birds could fly 100 miles, but they'd have to have a reason to. You'd have to have some sort of major failure in the valley to start pushing these birds hard enough to make them go 100 miles to the north. So while it's technically possible, unless people release birds up in Laredo Corpus, we're not going to see much of an expansion of the species. What about the legal status of red-crowned parrots? Well, they're actually not federally protected. They're considered native, but they're not on the endangered species list. That's mostly because it was a Republican administration that reviewed it. And even though by most readings they should have been classified as vulnerable or threatened, they ended up as not listed at all. They're also not listed on the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is really odd because most species are. They're technically protected in Texas, local city ordinances. They're considered native species, and they've just been listed as threatened by the state of Texas. So that should provide some protection. However, they're still legal to own as a pet, and we've seen no evidence of enforcement throughout our study of anybody confiscating them. This parrot in a cage was on the front yard, on the front porch of somebody's house, so not overly worried about hiding something that's illegal. And the big question for enforcement is, now that it's a state threatened species, will anything change? So what we have is a population that's reproducing well, that's using basically only urbanized habitat, that used to be increasing rapidly and now is stable. So something has changed. What's happened? What's going on? Well, some of the threats that we've hypothesized, hybridization wouldn't really change your population growth much, but habitat, maybe general changes, nest sites, poaching. So we'll go through these potential threats to the birds. Most Amazon parrots, if you put them in cages, they will interbreed and create fertile offspring. So while this wouldn't drive them extinct, it could threaten populations, kind of like your mallard and black ducks in the Northeast, where you just get fewer and fewer pure black ducks as mallards breed with them. Well, here's a lilac crown plus a red crown, and that is their offspring. So they are hybridizing in the Rio Grande Valley. They're hard to detect because you have species that look really similar to start with, and then they hybridize. But Simon's wonderful eye found at least 37 hybrids. Red-crowned parrots and lilac-crowned are the most common, 34 out of 37. Here's a hybrid hiding right here in the middle of the photo. Of 118 pairs, 1,118 pairs that Simon checked, he found 53 mixed pairs. Again, lilac-crowned and red-crowned were most common, but there were some red lord parrots that were mated to red crowns. This, he still doesn't really know what it is. He suspects it's a hybrid, including white-fronted parrots. So overall, there's some evidence of hybridization, but it doesn't seem to be a major concern for the population. Probably the best management strategy suggestion so far, keep monitoring it. If it starts to get worse, Texas Parks and Wildlife may consider going in and capturing some of the hybrids and removing them from the population. What about nest sites? Well, during Simon's intense work, we found about 128 potential nest trees. The nests were mostly in palms. We had 90 of them in palms and 38 in normal trees. So here's your 70% palm trees. And then March 2020, my graduate student Kelly went down with Simon to check on the status of those trees. What we found is that in about 2.5 years, 40% of the nest trees were lost. You can see 46% of the palms and 32% of the other substrates were just gone. And it looks like of those that we could tell, well, well, actually, of all of them, 41% were most likely removed by people. The 40% undetermined most likely had a bunch of people ones as well. So probably well over half of the ones that were lost actually were taken down by people, homeowners, governments, etc. Is this impacting the birds? It's most likely causing some potential problem. And as we talk about poaching, this may just be compounding the problems that are being faced by poaching. We figured that we needed to look, we didn't expect a big problem, but we figured we needed to look at poaching because that's one of the biggest problems facing parrots globally. This nest cavity on the top here was ripped out so that the person could reach down in and grab babies. Poaching for nestlings for sale is a huge problem globally, and we searched for evidence of poaching of birds being sold. We looked at local flea markets and Craigslist, and we looked for the signs of poaching on trees, destroyed nests, chicks disappearing, information from local people as well. We found 12 red-crowned parrots for sale, being sold for between $260 and $1,000. 8 of the vendors actually told us that they were poached locally. And 4 additional ones were probably poached. If we assume that maybe we got 1 out of every 4, which is actually a pretty high detection rate for stuff like this, that may be 32 to 48 parrots poached per year. That could be an extra 5 to 7% growth or an extra 100 to 200 birds over the 4-year study. So yeah, this poaching could be actually making a difference. And the poaching itself destroys nesting substrates, which kind of compounds that problem that we had on our previous slide. Here's another nest where a guy went up with a saw and cut it out. We actually had 1 nest box poached where it was a nest box with a lock on it that was up on a dead palm. The only way somebody could have gotten in there would be with a cherry picker. So we suspect that it was poached by members of the utility repair crews. And this was the stupidest one of any. A doctor had a nesting pair in his backyard. He cut the top off the tree and put a mouse sticky trap by the entrance to the nest cavity in the hopes, and a perch in the hopes of catching the parrots that were nesting in his backyard. Apparently it didn't work, not a surprise, but still the intention was there. And then there were a number of trees where when the babies would disappear and they would find circled in yellow here, trees climbing spike marks. In 2018, Simon reported that that there were about 24 to 29 nests that he had found that were active. 4 of these were poached. He suspects so that calculates out to about a 14 to 17% of the nests actually being poached. And this would represent about 3% of the population, an additional potentially 90 birds lost through this estimate. So regardless, we're looking at 100 to 200 birds that should be there, that should have caused our population to grow, but didn't. Good news, I guess, there's no evidence of other major threats. Feral cats, dogs, hawk, snakes, lack of food, weather, disease, none of them showed up that we could tell as being anything particularly important. So as we look towards the future, our habitat, it's all urban. It's mostly private. It's totally artificial. The habitat is mostly, but not completely occupied. There may be some room for expansion. Urban expansion may increase habitat a bit more in the valley, but we're not going to get big changes in the areas that they're inhabiting. Many of the key plant species are not native. So when you think about that, it just basically drives home that management for this species is not going to be traditional. You're not going to be setting up big protected areas, even suburban protected areas, and conserving the species in that way. The population is breeding well. The steady growth from the 1990s to the 2010s was all from real population reproduction, but no growth 2016 to 2021. We think the poaching may be reducing the growth by 3 to 7%, and that could be enough to actually level off this population. Is nest site limiting? Are nest sites limiting? It could be adding to the problem. We haven't studied enough to figure out if there's a lot of extra nest sites that aren't being used, but it's certainly getting rid of traditional nest sites certainly could be a problem. What about other things? Well, if we look towards the future, what can we do to help manage this population? Most likely, the biggest thing we can do, since these birds are embedded in a completely artificial human landscape, is to educate the public. Most people don't know they're considered native. Most people don't know that they have any local or state protected status. And a lot of people really love parrots. We get people, not just bird watchers, but local people. Oh yeah, the parrots, they come, they sleep in here, then they go to there, they go over to here. And the majority of people that we run into really enjoy having them around. So I think through a billboard, schools, et cetera campaign, we probably could raise the profile of these guys and let people know that they're protected. And probably also is important to actually enforce some of the laws. City ordinances are pretty hard to enforce, but now that we have state threatened status, there's a much better chance of being able to let people know through confiscations and prosecutions that it's not okay to mess with the birds. And it's probably a good idea for them to be reconsidered for the Endangered Species Act. If you read over the information we have, and at the time we didn't know they were stable. We thought that the population in Texas was continuing to rise, to increase. Now that we know they're stable, well, now that we know about poaching, it's probably not a bad idea to go head back to the Endangered Species Act, and hopefully with a Democrat in the White House, we'd get a better shake at being declared at least vulnerable. Overall, as I mentioned before, the parrots want what the people want: native and non-native plants. People plant things that they can eat and that have pretty flowers and fruits, and that just works wonderfully for the parrots. So suburbanization in the lower Rio Grande Valley will, for the most part, help these birds. But it is important to preserve habitat, limit tree trimming and clear cutting out areas. And I think it's really important to promote planting of new habitat. New suburban areas should be planting and ensuring in order to ensure the viability of the population going forward. For nesting sites, there's a really high turnover rate in our nest sites, and that means that new plantings are important. Again, I think education is key. Telling homeowners not to knock down their older trees or their palms, and to plant new ones. Perhaps we should be working with plant retailers. Plant me, I'm a parrot friendly. Find ways to promote the planting of parrot friendly plants. Also, local governments and land managers. The Army Corps of Engineers in South Texas was looking to revamp one of the resacas, one of the little oxbow lakes, and they were going to remove all the non-native plants. Well, some of those non-natives were the palms that the parrots like to nest in. So actually informing local governments and land managers about the types of plants that are important for these parrots may be important in keeping them in the landscape. Preserving current nest sites, leave standing dead palms whenever possible. Try not to remove your old messy tree. And the problem is they're so often right next to the driveway or right in the front yard and in places where people just want it to look nice, and it's hard to argue with that. Also, if a dead palm tree that's 40 feet tall is going to fall on your roof or your car or your child, it's hard to tell people to let it stand. So when it's safe, try and leave them standing. And the other thing to think about, these palms don't live that long. We need to be planting new plants, new nest trees, including the palm trees, because the plants we plant today are the nest sites of the future. There's some possibility for nest boxes. These are some dead palm nest boxes at the Valley Nature Center. And sometimes they are used. Some are quite successful, others less so. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody who helped with this, the guys from Texas Parks and Wildlife, the parrot group down in South Texas, the people in my lab and at Texas A&M, Tom White is the guy holding the parrot up here, a buddy and good parrot biologist. And of course, Simon, who's done excellent work. Here's Simon photographed here along with me. Excellent work in order to get, and took some really good photographs too. Most of his photographs and videos are from him as well. So with that, it looks like I left a little time for people to ask some questions. I'm at 41 minutes, and Josh said he was going to machete me if I went over 45. So we're in good shape.
All right. First, I'm going to stop the recording here so that